Let me tell you something that nobody in your life has had the courage to say to you yet. The person who made you feel worthless, the person who made you question your own memory, the person who smiled at you in public and dismantled you in private, that person is not powerful. They never were. What you have been living inside is not the shadow of someone stronger than you. It is the elaborate, exhausting performance of someone who is more fragile than you could ever imagine. And the moment you truly understand that, not just intellectually, not just as a comforting idea you repeat to yourself at night, but the moment it lands in your bones as absolute truth, everything changes. The dynamic shifts, the spell breaks, and they feel it before you even say a word. That is what this video is about. Not revenge, not manipulation tactics, not how to win arguments or get the last word. This is about something far more powerful than any of that. This is about understanding the architecture of a narcissistic ego so completely, so precisely, that you become the one thing a narcissist cannot survive, someone who sees them clearly and is no longer afraid of what they see. There are 6 ways to destroy a narcissist's ego, and by the time this video is over, you are going to know all 6 of them. Not as abstract concepts, as tools, as weapons if you need them to be. But first, you need to understand what you are actually dealing with, because most people get this completely wrong, and that misunderstanding is the exact reason they stay trapped for months, sometimes years longer than they ever needed to. Here is the mistake almost everyone makes. They think the narcissist in their life is confident. They look at the way that person commands a room, the way they speak with absolute certainty, the way they never seem to doubt themselves, never seem to apologize, never seem to carry the weight of anything they have done. And they conclude that this is a person with an unshakable sense of self. A person who is, in some fundamental way, more put together than they are. And from inside that belief, recovery feels impossible. Because how do you stand up to someone who genuinely does not care? How do you stop being affected by someone who seems completely bulletproof? You cannot. And that is the trap. Because the premise is wrong. Narcissistic confidence is not real confidence. It is the most sophisticated imitation of confidence that the human mind is capable of producing. Underneath the arrogance, underneath the contempt, underneath the absolute refusal to ever be wrong, there is a psychological structure so brittle, so desperately maintained, so dependent on outside input that it makes your worst day of self-doubt look like bedrock by comparison. The narcissist does not have a strong ego, they have a false one, and the difference between a strong ego and a false one is everything, because a strong ego can survive being challenged. A false ego cannot. A strong ego can tolerate your independence, your disagreement, your growth, your happiness without them. A false ego experiences all those things as existential threats. Not inconveniences, not irritations. Existential threats. This is the truth that changes how you see every single interaction you have ever had with this person. Every time they exploited at something that seemed minor, it was not because you said the wrong thing. It was because the false self cannot regulate its own emotional state and needed to make you responsible for stabilizing it. Every time they rewrote history and told you that your memory of events was wrong, it was not because they genuinely remembered it differently. It was because the false self cannot coexist with a version of reality that reflects poorly on it. Every silent treatment, every withdrawal of affection, every moment where they made you beg for basic warmth. None of it was strength. All of it was a person using the only tools they have to keep a constructed identity from falling apart. You were not dealing with someone too strong to be affected by you. You were dealing with someone so affected by everything that they built an entire personality designed to make you believe otherwise. Sit with that for a moment. Now here's where it gets important. Understanding this does not mean feeling sorry for them. Understanding this does not mean excusing what was done to you or minimizing the very real damage that was caused. The fragility of the narcissist is not your responsibility to manage or to heal. It never was. What this understanding does is something far more useful. It relocates the power. Because if the narcissist's ego is not a fortress but a fabrication, then the things you do, the way you carry yourself, the choices you make about how much access they have to you, and your emotional world, all of those things have far more impact than you have been led to believe. You are not powerless here. You never were. You were just operating without the right information. That changes now. The 6 methods we are going to cover are not theoretical. They are practical, they are psychological, and they work precisely because they target the specific vulnerabilities of the narcissistic ego, rather than trying to fight it on its own terms. Fighting a narcissist on their own terms is a losing game. They have been playing it their entire lives, but playing a different game entirely, one built on clarity, boundaries, emotional mastery, and relentless self-respect. That is a game they have no answer for. Stay with me, because what comes next is going to reframe everything. The first way to destroy a narcissist's ego is detachment. And before you tell yourself you already know what that means, I want you to stop. Because what most people think detachment means and what it actually requires are two completely different things. Most people think detachment means not caring. They think it means building a wall, going cold, shutting down emotionally, and presenting a blank face to the world. That is not detachment. That is suppression. And suppression does not work because the narcissist can feel the difference. They can sense the effort behind the wall. They can sense that underneath the performance of not caring, you are still very much engaged, still very much affected, still very much theirs in every way that matters to them. Real detachment is not a performance. It is a neurological shift. Let me explain what actually happens inside your brain when you have been in a relationship with a narcissist. Whether that relationship is romantic, familial, or professional, the pattern they use, the cycle of warmth and cruelty, the unpredictable alternation between making you feel chosen and making you feel worthless. This pattern does something specific to your brain chemistry. It hijacks your dopamine system. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical, despite what you may have heard. Dopamine is the anticipation chemical. It is the neurological response to the possibility of reward. And what a narcissist's hot and cold behavior does is keep you in a permanent state of anticipation. You are always waiting for the warmth to come back, always waiting for the version of them that made you feel so good at the beginning. Your brain is not addicted to the person. Your brain is addicted to the cycle, to the hope, to the almost. That is why logic does not break the bond. That is why knowing they are bad for you does not make you stop thinking about them. That is why you can rehearse every cruel thing they ever did and still find yourself reaching for your phone to check if they have messaged. It is not weakness. It is neuroscience. And understanding that it is neuroscience difference toward actually dismantling it. Detachment is the process of starving that cycle. Every time you resist the urge to check their social media, you weaken the neural pathway. Every time you feel the pull to respond to a provocation and you choose not to, you are literally rewiring your brain. Neuroscientists call this process synaptic pruning. The pathways that are not used begin to weaken and eventually dissolve. The bond was built through repetition. It is dismantled through repetition. Not one dramatic decision made on a good day. A daily, consistent, sometimes hourly practice of redirecting your attention away from them and back toward yourself. And here is what happens when you do it long enough. Here is the part that matters most. The narcissist feels it, not because you told them, not because you made an announcement or sent a final message. They feel it because their psychological survival depends on your emotional availability. They need you engaged. They need you reactive. They need you in the cycle. Your anger feeds them. Your pain feeds them. Even your attempts to reason with them feed them. The only thing that does not feed them is your genuine, settled, neurological indifference. And when that indifference begins to develop, when you stop being available as an emotional resource, their ego begins to destabilize in ways that no argument, no confrontation, and no amount of calling them out ever could. Your absence is louder than anything you could ever say. Use it. The second way to destroy a narcissist's ego is through boundaries, but not the kind of boundaries most people set, which are really just requests dressed up in firm language. A real boundary is not something you communicate. It is something you enforce. And the distinction between those two things is the difference between a boundary that works and a boundary that becomes another instrument of their control over you. Here is what happens when most people try to set boundaries with a narcissist. They explain the boundary, they justify it, they provide context, history, emotional reasoning. They say, when you do this, I feel that, and so I need you to stop. And the narcissist listens, or appears to listen, and then does one of several things. They argue that the boundary is unfair. They reframe your self-protection as an attack on them. They agree to the boundary and then systematically test it until you either enforce it or abandon it. And if you keep explaining, keep justifying, keep trying to make them understand, you have already lost, because the conversation itself is the trap. The goal of the conversation from their side is not to reach understanding. The goal is to get you to lower the boundary by making you feel unreasonable for having it in the first place. So you stop explaining completely. A boundary is an action, not a statement. If you said you would leave the room when they raised their voice, you leave the room without commentary, without a look, without anything that could be interpreted as an invitation to escalate or negotiate. If you said you would not respond to messages after a certain hour, the message goes unanswered, without an explanation the next morning, without a justification, without an apology for the silence. The boundary is demonstrated through behavior, repeatedly, consistently, without exception. Every time you hold a boundary without explaining it, you do something to a narcissist that is genuinely destabilizing. You demonstrate that you cannot be argued out of your own self-respect. And for a person whose entire relational strategy is built on the assumption that everyone can eventually be manipulated back into compliance, that demonstration is terrifying. It does not just frustrate them. It forces them to confront something they have spent their entire life engineering their way around, the reality that they do not have control over you, and each time they are confronted with that reality, the false self cracks a little further, not because you are punishing them, because you are finally, completely treating your own well-being as non-negotiable. That is not cruelty, that is freedom. Section 3, the next two weapons, EML, geniality and self-growth. Words 2001-3000. The third way to destroy a narcissist's ego is emotional neutrality. And I want to be very precise about what this means, because it is the most misunderstood concept in every conversation about narcissistic abuse, and the misunderstanding costs people enormously. Emotional neutrality does not mean you stop feeling. It does not mean you become robotic, cold, or disconnected from your own inner life. It does not mean you pretend nothing affects you. What it means is this: you stop performing your emotions for their consumption. You stop allowing your internal experience to become external data that they can collect, interpret, and use to calibrate their next move against you. Because that is exactly what a narcissist does with your emotions. Every single one of them. Your joy is useful to them because it confirms their power to elevate you. Your sadness is useful because it confirms their power to diminish you. Your anger is useful because it proves you are still invested, still in the game, still emotionally tethered to them in a way they can exploit. Even your attempts to stay calm are useful if they can see the effort it is costing you, because effort means you still care enough to manage yourself around them. The only emotional response that gives them nothing, the only one they genuinely cannot work with, is neutrality. Not performed neutrality, not gritted teeth, controlled breathing neutrality that is visible from across the room. Genuine, settled, unforced flatness. The kind of response that communicates, without a single word, that whatever they just said or did simply did not land the way they intended. Watch what happens when you respond to a narcissist's provocation with calm, measured, completely unreactive energy. Watch what they do next. They escalate, they push harder, they say something more outrageous, more cutting, more designed to get a reaction. They test the boundary of your composure with increasing desperation, and that desperation, that visible, almost frantic need to provoke a response from you, tells you everything you need to know about the nature of what was happening all along. They were never trying to resolve anything with you. They were never trying to communicate or connect or work through conflict. They were trying to activate you, because your activation is their regulation. Your emotional dysregulation is the thing that stabilizes them. Read that again slowly. Your emotional dysregulation is what stabilizes them. This is the parasitic core of the narcissistic dynamic. They do not have a stable internal emotional system. They cannot self-regulate. So they borrow your nervous system instead. They provoke you into a reaction, and your reaction, whether it is tears, anger, pleading, or withdrawal, gives them the emotional data they need to feel oriented, in control, and real. The moment you stop providing that data, they are left alone with a psychological interior they have spent their entire life running from. And that is not your problem to solve. That is the consequence of choosing not to do their emotional labor anymore. Emotional neutrality is a skill. It takes practice. Your nervous system has been conditioned through months or years of intermittent reinforcement to respond. The triggers are real. The physiological responses are real. When they say the thing that always gets to you, your heart rate spikes before your conscious mind has even processed the words. That is not a character flaw. That is a trauma response. And it lives in the body, not in the mind, which is why deciding to be neutral is not enough on its own. You have to train the body, breath work, grounding, deliberate, consistent nervous system regulation until your baseline shifts, and the provocations simply do not reach you the way they used to. But when you get there, when you can sit across from someone who once had the power to shatter your entire day with a single sentence and feel nothing but quiet, settled clarity, the shift in the room is unmistakable. You become, in that moment, someone they cannot reach, someone who is right there in front of them, and yet completely beyond their grasp. And for a person who has built their entire sense of self on the ability to control the emotional atmosphere around them, encountering someone they genuinely cannot move is not just frustrating. It is the closest thing to ego death they will ever experience without losing consciousness. That stillness is more powerful than any confrontation you will ever have. Use it. The fourth way to destroy a narcissist's ego is self-growth. Visible, undeniable, relentless self-growth. And I want you to understand the psychological mechanics of why this works. Because on the surface it might seem too simple. Just improve your life, and they will be bothered by it. But what is actually happening is far more precise than that, and when you understand the mechanism, you will pursue your growth with a different kind of intentionality. When a narcissist ends a relationship with you, or when you finally find the strength to leave, they do not walk away neutral. They walk away with a story. They need that story the way they need oxygen, because without it, they are left holding the full weight of what they actually did. The story says you are the problem. You are too sensitive, too needy, too unstable, too much, not enough. They tell this story to mutual friends. They tell it to their next partner. Most dangerously, they tell it to themselves over and over, because the false self cannot survive in a reality where they are the one who caused harm. You're suffering in the aftermath of the relationship. The gray eye of the confusion, the loss of confidence, actually serves their narrative. It confirms it. It is painful proof that they were right about you all along. Your growth destroys the story entirely. When you begin to heal, when you rebuild your confidence and your clarity and your sense of direction, when your life begins to visibly improve, when you look healthier, move with more purpose, pursue goals you shelved while you were busy surviving someone else's chaos, the narcissist is confronted with a cognitive dissonance they cannot resolve within their existing framework. If you were the problem, why are you thriving without them? If you were broken, why do you look more whole than you ever did inside the relationship? If they were the superior one, the stable one, the one holding everything together, why does your life look better now that they are not in it? They will not say this out loud. They may never acknowledge it to another living person, but it works on them. It gnaws at the foundation of the false self in a way that is slow and quiet and absolutely relentless, because the false self requires a world that cooperates with its narrative, and your growth is a living, breathing, daily contradiction to everything it needs to believe. So go back to school, start the business, write the book, get physically stronger, build friendships with people who see you clearly and celebrate who you are becoming. Invest in therapy, not as damage control, but as architecture, as the deliberate construction of a self that is stronger, more grounded, and more self-aware than anything the relationship ever allowed you to be. Every step forward is a step out of the identity they assigned to you, and every step out of that identity is another crack in the carefully constructed world they need in order to feel safe. Grow like your freedom depends on it, because it does. The fifth way to destroy a narcissist's ego is the withdrawal of validation. And this one requires a level of honesty with yourself that most people are not prepared for, because the withdrawal of validation does not just mean stopping the compliments. It does not just mean refusing to tell them they are talented, attractive, or impressive. It means something far more total and far more difficult than that. It means cutting off every single form of emotional output directed toward them, including the negative ones, including the arguments, including the tears, including the conversations with mutual friends where you try to make sense of what happened, including the hours you spend replaying interactions in your mind, analyzing their behavior, trying to decode their motivations. All of it is validation. All of it is supply. This is the part that genuinely shocks most people when they first hear it, because it feels deeply unfair. You are the one who is hurt. You are the one who is trying to process something real and painful and destabilizing. Why should you have to silence your grief to protect someone who never protected you? And the answer is, you are not doing it for them. You are doing it for yourself. Because every ounce of mental and emotional energy you direct toward the narcissist, regardless of whether it is warm or cold, adoring or furious, is energy that belongs to your recovery and is instead being funneled back into a dynamic that has already taken enough from you. The clinical term for what they are seeking is narcissistic supply. And the thing that makes it so insidious is that negative supply. Your pain, your anger, your public statements about what they did is almost as nourishing to the narcissistic ego as positive. When you post about them, they feel relevant. When you post about them, they feel relevant. When you argue with them, they feel powerful. When you cry because of something they said, they feel they still have access to the interior of your life. Even your hatred keeps them close. Even your obsession with understanding them keeps the door open. And what the narcissistic ego cannot tolerate, what genuinely threatens the structural integrity of the false self, is not your anger, not your exposure of them, not your confrontation. It is your indifference, your complete, genuine, unperformed indifference, not as a tactic, not as a strategy you maintain while secretly hoping they notice, as a real internal shift that happens when you have done enough work on yourself that they simply no longer occupy the center of your attention. That shift takes time, it takes grief, real, honest, uncomfortable grief, not for the person they actually were, but for the person you believed them to be. The relationship you thought you were building, the future you thought you were moving toward together. That loss is real even if the version of them you are grieving never existed, and you have to let yourself feel it fully, because the only way out of that grief is through it. Trying to skip the morning by staying angry, staying obsessed, staying engaged in the narrative, that is not healing. That is a longer, more exhausting version of the same trap. But when you come out the other side, when the grief has moved through you completely, and what remains is not bitterness, not longing, not rage, but simply a quiet, settled understanding, the validation stops naturally. Not because you are withholding it as a weapon, because there is genuinely nothing left to give. You see them clearly now. You understand what they are and what they are not. What they are not. And what you see does not inspire love, does not inspire hate, does not inspire the kind of emotional charge that keeps people circling each other for years after a relationship has ended. What you see inspires something far more liberating than either of those things. It inspires clarity. And that clarity, that clean, unambiguous absence of emotional electricity, is the narcissist's famine, because they cannot feed on someone who has nothing left to offer them. And they cannot manufacture the supply they need from someone who has genuinely moved on. Your freedom is their famine. Remember that. The sixth and final way to destroy a narcissist's ego is strategic truth, not confrontation, not a dramatic public unmasking, not the carefully constructed argument you have been rehearsing for months that lays out every lie they told and every harm they caused in devastating, irrefutable detail. Strategic truth is quieter than any of that, and it is more devastating than all of it combined. Strategic truth means living in such complete alignment with your own reality that the narcissist's distortions cannot survive in your presence. It means holding your version of events with a calm, unshakable certainty that does not require their agreement, does not require witnesses, does not require anyone else to validate it. It means when they tell you it did not happen that way, you do not argue, you do not produce evidence, you do not appeal to logic or fairness or the basic human expectation that shared history should be remembered honestly. You simply remain in your truth, quietly, completely, without flinching. Gaslighting only works when the target begins to doubt their own perception. The entire mechanism depends on your willingness to question yourself. And strategic truth is the absolute refusal to do that. Not out of rigidity, not out of defensiveness, but out of a deep and earned respect for your own mind and your own experience. You were there. You know what happened. You know what was said and what was done and how it felt and what I meant. No amount of confident rewriting, no amount of recruited witnesses, no amount of calm and convincing distortion changes what you know to be true. And here is what happens when you hold that truth in the presence of someone whose entire psychological architecture is built on distortion. They cannot engage with it. The narcissistic ego is a distortion field. It operates by bending reality to serve the false self. And truth is the one frequency that the distortion field cannot bend. So they do what they always do when they encounter something they cannot control. They deflect. They attack. They change the subject. They leave the room. They go and tell their version of events to anyone who will listen, but they do not address the truth directly, because to address it directly would be to acknowledge it. And to acknowledge it would mean the false self, not to you, to themselves. And that is the one confrontation they have spent their entire life engineering their way out of. So they run. And their running tells you everything you will ever need to know. You are no longer inside the distortion. You are standing outside it, watching it clearly for exactly what it is. And the narcissist knows on some level, they will never consciously admit to, that the game is over, not because you announced it, not because you won an argument, but because your presence, your grounded, clear-eyed, emotionally settled presence, makes the game impossible to play. Now let us bring all six together, because the real power is not in any single method. The real power is in what happens when you practice all of them at once. Detachment rewires the neurological bond and removes their access to your nervous system. Boundaries eliminate their ability to use your own compliance against you. Emotional neutrality starves the supply and forces them to sit with a self they have never learned to tolerate. Self-growth dismantles the narrative they need in order to justify everything they did to you. Validation withdrawal removes the last thread connecting your emotional energy to their psychological survival, and strategic truth renders the distortion field inoperable, not through force, but through the simple radical act of knowing yourself completely. None of this requires you to become someone you are not. None of this requires cruelty, coldness, or the abandonment of your own capacity for empathy and warmth. What it requires is the decision made once and then remade every single day until it no longer needs to be made, that your psychological freedom is worth more than their comfort, that your clarity is worth more than their approval, that the version of you that existed before they got to you, curious, open, trusting, full of life and possibility, that version deserves to come back. Not a harder, more guarded version, not a version that has learned to love less, or trust less, or feel less. The full version, the real one, because here is the thing they needed you never to find out. The thing the false self depends on you never understanding. You were never the problem. You were the solution to their emptiness, to their fragility, to their inability to generate a sense of self from the inside. They found in you someone with enough warmth, enough empathy, enough genuine emotional depth to keep the false self inflated, and they used it. And somewhere in the part of themselves they will never examine honestly, they know exactly what they did. And now, so do you. That knowledge is not the end of your story, it is the beginning of the only chapter that has ever truly belonged to you.